The fire was nearly out. She sat close to it anyway, the last crackles of orange light licking at her skirts, warming nothing. Ash clung to her skin like second breath. Her palms were raw from dragging his body, from the scorched wagon to the rocks, where she could pretend it hadn't happened. But it had. And he was dead. The prairie stretched around her in every direction, a hollow drum beneath the sky. Stars pressed down, too many and too bright. Silence ruled this part of the country. Even the wind was hesitant. Her lips cracked when she whispered, "Go ahead," though no one had asked her anything. She glanced sideways at the dark shape that used to be her husband. A boot jutted into view from behind a log. She didn't cover him. Couldn't. The blanket had burned when the wagon caught fire. Everything had burned. The memory of that morning came back in shreds. The wagon train, halted near creaked. Her husband coughing, blood, not words. Settlers growing nervous. Someone shouted about Apache territory, though they'd seen no signs. Just fear pretending to be foresight. When she refused to leave him, they made a show of kindness. A sack of flour, half a canteen. Then the horses turned, and she watched their wheels shrink into dust. She didn't cry when they vanished. She cried hours later, when the sun fell and the coyotes started singing. Now, she didn't cry at all. She watched the fire like it might blink first. Something shifted on the hill. She didn't move. Only her eyes slid toward the ridgeline. A silhouette stood where the moonlight broke on the rocks. Not a beast. Not a ghost. A man, upright, unmoving. She stared until her vision blurred. When she blinked, he was gone. The fire sighed and dropped a coal. She reached toward her husband's pistol where it lay on the dirt, 3 feet away. Her fingers dug into the ground, but she couldn't will them forward. Her body, starved and scraped, refused to trust her. A sound came from the dark behind her. Not heavy enough for boots, not rustling like animals. Bare feet, maybe. Human, deliberate. She turned slow, mouth dry as grit. He stood just beyond the firelight, tall, wrapped in doeskin and shadow. His face unreadable, half-lit in flickering orange. Black hair tied back, eyes steady, like the land itself was watching her through him. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Fear came quiet, cold. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't speak. She tried to form words, but they stuck like marrow. Her gaze dropped to his hands, empty. Then she looked past him and saw the darkness beyond, the way he'd emerged from it like smoke. He stepped forward, slow and measured, and dropped something beside the fire. A canteen. She blinked at it, then up at him. He said nothing. The flames danced in his eyes, and for a moment she thought he might speak. Instead, he turned and walked back into the black, swallowed by it without sound. She stared at the canteen, stared for a long time. Then her fingers reached out, hesitant, slow, like touching a snake that might strike. The water inside was cold, clean. She drank it too fast and choked. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on her side, pistol under one hand now, the canteen clutched in the other. The stars above her spun slowly, indifferent. At dawn, she found a piece of dried meat where the canteen had been. She hadn't heard him return, hadn't seen a sign of him in the dirt. No tracks, no shadow. Just the food, carefully placed. She stared at it until the sun crested over the ridge, and then she ate. Every bite felt like swallowing pride, like chewing guilt. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She wasn't grateful. She was alive. The third night, he came again. This time, she sat up as he approached. Her fingers hovered over the pistol. He didn't flinch. He placed the canteen beside her and looked down, his face softer than stone, but harder than mercy. His eyes lingered on her husband's corpse. She watched him, watched the way his jaw shifted, the breath in his chest, the thing in his throat he chose not to say. He turned to leave. "What do you want?" she rasped. He paused, just for a heartbeat. Then he disappeared into the dark, like the question had never happened. She stared at the space where he'd been, her pulse louder than the wind. A part of her wanted him gone. The rest of her was afraid that, if he left, she'd know for certain she wasn't worth coming back for. The next morning, she buried her husband. Her hands shook as she dug, the earth stubborn and dry. She didn't say a prayer. She couldn't remember the words. Instead, she whispered the name of the creek, the last one they'd passed together. She said it like a spell, like it might bring meaning to the hole in the ground. When it was done, she sat beside the grave and ran her fingers over the dirt. Her nails were black with it, her breath shallow. That night, he didn't come. She hated how it hollowed her, how the silence returned and brought with it the truth. She was alone again. The wind picked up. Her fire wouldn't light. She wrapped herself in a coat that wasn't hers, curled against the base of a rock, and tried not to dream. When she woke, she was warm. A fur had been laid across her, heavy, soft. She opened her eyes to find a different kind of silence, one that listened. He stood a dozen feet away, watching her. She sat up slowly, letting the fur slip from her shoulders. Her throat hurt when she spoke. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. He looked to the horizon. The sky was bleeding pink, then almost too quiet to catch. No one should die alone. She stared at him, heart slow but heavy. No one should die alone. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't kindness. It was just true. He turned to go. "Wait," she said, though she didn't know why. He paused again. She didn't ask his name, didn't offer hers. The space between them wasn't ready for names. But when he left, he looked back once, and she thought maybe, just maybe, this was not the end of something. Maybe it was the start. The sky was a cruel white when she opened her eyes again, the sun sharpening the ridgeline above her like a blade. Her back ached. Her mouth tasted of iron and sleep, and everything around her smelled like dust. But something was different. The wind sounded wrong. She sat up too fast. The prairie was gone. Around her, rough walls of red stone curved inward like cupped hands. The cave was shallow but dry, shielded from the wind by a lip of rock that jutted out like the brow of a frowning god. The fire in the center was fresh, its embers a deep orange hum. She pulled the fur tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the scent, smoke, leather, and something wild. Then she saw him. He sat near the mouth of the cave, legs folded, eyes on the horizon. A knife lay across his knee, blade darkened by time and use. He hadn't shaved. His hair was still tied back, but a single strand had come loose and danced in a breeze. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. Her throat was a narrow tunnel of raw silence. He didn't turn. "Eat," he said. She looked down. Beside her on a flat stone was a strip of dried meat and a few wrinkled berries. The sight of food made her stomach twist in confusion. Was it hunger or shame? She picked up the meat, chewed slowly. It was tough and bitter, but it kept her here. He didn't ask questions. Not about her name, her husband, the train that left her behind. And she didn't ask about him, not yet. Whatever bridge might have existed between them was still only rope and thread. One false word and it would snap. Later, when the wind picked up and howled down the canyon mouth, she crawled to the back of the cave. There were symbols there, ochre lines drawn by a hand that had cared once. A sun with too many rays. A man with no eyes. A bird whose wings were broken and bleeding. She traced them with one finger. The dust felt sacred. "You draw these?" she asked. He didn't answer. His silence was deliberate, not ignorant. Like he knew the power of saying too much. Days passed that way, no names, no past, just weather and stone and the rhythm of surviving. She slept more. He brought roots, small game, boiled things in a pot that smelled like bitter soil and tasted better than it should have. Her strength returned piece by piece, though she hid how weak she still was. Pride was one of the few things she had left. One morning she caught herself humming. It was a hymn, half remembered from a church long behind her. She didn't know why it came out. Maybe the stillness had cracked something open. But when she realized, she stopped, lips clamping shut like a trap. He was watching, not judging, just listening. Head tilted like the tune had stirred something deep in the bones. "You believe?" he asked. She wasn't sure how to answer. The word believe felt too big. She wanted to say yes, but also no, and maybe most of all, "I used to." "I don't know anymore," she said. He nodded like that made perfect sense. They hunted together after that. She wasn't good at it, Not yet, but he showed her how to move quiet, how to read bent grass and animal droppings, how to smell rain before it arrived. He didn't teach with words. He showed with hands, glances, the occasional low whistle when she did something right. The world began to shift. The cave stopped feeling like a hole and started feeling like a place. Her body no longer ached every morning. Her mind no longer whispered her husband's name in every silence. One night, as the firelight painted his face in gold and shadow, she asked, "Why did you save me?" He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I lost someone," he said, "long before this war. Before the bluecoats came with their wagons and paper promises. I left my people to grieve. When I came back, I was no longer one of them." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. He reached beside him and pulled something from a hide bundle, a small carving, smoothed by time. He handed it to her. It was a creature shaped from dark wood, half bird, half horse, strange and delicate. "I made it for her," he said. Never finished it. She held it carefully, thumb brushing along its back. It was beautiful and broken in the way all real things were. "What happened to her?" she asked, barely a whisper. "Settlers," he said. No more than that. That night, she dreamed of smoke and gunshots, of wagons turning while the land bled behind them. She woke before dawn, her body cold, her hand still clutching the bird horse. The seasons began to change. The wind tasted different. Birds came and went. She learned how to gut a rabbit, how to twist sage into twine, how to patch a tear in hide with a bone needle. She wasn't good yet, but she was trying. Once, while he was gone for a day, she walked outside the cave and screamed into the canyon, just to hear herself alive. He never asked why her voice was hoarse that evening. Another night, when the sky cracked with distant thunder, she sat too close to the fire, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't look at him when she said it. "My husband wasn't a kind man." He didn't answer, but the silence between them felt warmer than before. She went on, voice flat. "He hit when he drank, took more than he gave. When they left us behind, he said they'd come back, that they'd miss the weight of their guilt." She laughed then. It was a sharp, brittle sound. "He died, believing they'd return. I think part of me hated him for it." He reached over, slowly, and added a branch to the fire. The sparks jumped high and vanished. "You stayed," he said simply. "I was stupid." "No," he replied. "You remembered something they forgot." She didn't ask what he meant. But that night, when she lay down, she slept without dreaming. In the morning, he handed her a strip of leather, a necklace. On it was the wooden carving, finished now, smoothed and oiled. She took it with slow hands. Her eyes burned, but she said nothing. Outside, a hawk circled high. The wind rose. Later, as they walked down to the creek for water, he stopped. "There are riders," he said. She stiffened. "Settlers." He looked eastward. Not like the last ones. Guns. Packs. Tracks too fresh. Fear rushed back into her bones like floodwater. "They're looking for someone?" He didn't answer, but his jaw set. She looked up at him, her voice lower now. "Will they come here?" He studied the horizon. Then, almost reluctantly, yes. They stood in silence for a long time. She touched the carving at her neck. It felt heavier now, realer. "What do we do?" she asked. His eyes didn't leave the east. "We prepare." The old rifle lay across her lap, like a question waiting to be answered. She hadn't held a weapon since the wagon. Not like this. Not with purpose. But now, with the cave behind her and his eyes scanning the far hills, the weight of it felt less like violence and more like decision. He knelt by the tracks again. His fingers brushed over a bent tuft of grass, then tapped the earth. 3 depressions in the soil, each shaped like a boot that hadn't earned the right to walk here. 5, he said. She frowned. Only 3 prints. 2 walking, 3 mounted. Switching off to rest the horses. They'll come hard and tired. She nodded, heart loud in her throat. He didn't look at her when he added, "They'll come mean." The air was tighter than usual, as though the land itself were bracing for something. The smell of smoke drifted faint on the wind. Not fire smoke, but something heavier, gunpowder maybe. Or memory. She followed him down the trail he'd carved weeks ago, back when he'd shown her where the creek forked into a thin ravine. They'd hauled water in silence back then. Now, they walked it like two people who knew what silence meant. The ravine would serve as a choke point. He'd already placed snares, scattered sharp stones, tied brush low with fine twine to trip anyone rushing in. None of it would stop bullets, but it might buy moments. Out here, moments were currency. Back at the cave, he handed her a knife. Bone handle, worn smooth. "If they come here," he said, "you run." She didn't take it. "If they find me," he continued, "they'll want more than what's in the fire." She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the edge of death, she said something with iron behind it. "I'm not running." A pause. He studied her face, not to argue, but to measure how far she'd come. Then, finally, he gave a single nod. Not approval. Acknowledgement. They made ready in silence. He moved through preparations like a man who'd done it too many times before, checking lines, packing salt into small cloth bundles, wetting arrowheads with a black tar that smelled like pine and war. She prepared too. Stacked stones near the ridge's edge for throwing. Loosened the stitches on her coat so she could move faster. Dug a second trench behind the fire, shallow enough to lie in. That night, the fire was small and smokeless. They sat across from each other. She wanted to ask who the men were, why they hunted him. But the shape of his silence said it wasn't one reason. It was a lifetime of them. Instead, she said, "Tell me something real." He looked at her long, then said, "When I was a boy, I carved animals into tree trunks. My mother used to slap my hands for dulling the knife. One day, I made a deer so small it fit on a coin." She smiled. "Did she still slap you?" He shook his head. She cried. Morning broke without warning. No birds. No breeze. Just a stillness thick as tar. He left before dawn to check the traps. She sat by the cave's edge, rifle balanced across her knees, staring east. They came with the light. Dust first, kicked up in swirls. Then outlines, 3 riders, 2 on foot, just like he said. One man raised a spyglass, scanning the ridge like he already knew the bones of this place. She ducked, heart pounding. The men didn't approach straight. They looped wide, testing the land, looking for weakness. These weren't drifters. They moved like men who'd burned towns before breakfast. She heard the snap of a snare, the yelp of a surprised curse. Her breath caught. Then came the gunfire. A single shot cracked through the still air. One of the riders dropped, his mount kicking wild. Shouts echoed, panic, fury. Another shot, sharper this time. She gripped the rifle tighter, moved behind the boulder, eyes searching for the dark blur of his coat among the brush. 2 men fired blindly into the hills. A third dragged the fallen, screaming something she couldn't catch. They didn't see her. Not yet. Then a 4th voice rose, closer, too close. A shadow moved at the cave mouth. She swung the rifle. Too late. A boot kicked the weapon from her hands. She fell backward, head slamming rock. Dazed. A man loomed over her, face crusted with dust, eyes full of violence. His hand went to his belt. She scrambled, reaching for the knife. He grabbed her wrist. She bit him. Hard. He shouted and drew back, fist raised. But the blow never came. A thud. A grunt. Then silence. She opened her eyes. The man was on the ground, arrow jutting from his neck like a brutal truth. Blood pooled into the dirt. He stood behind him, bow still raised, breathing steady. She couldn't speak, could only nod. He turned without a word, heading back toward the ridge. Another shot rang out. She ducked, heart in her throat. From the ridge, another scream. Then hooves, wild fleeing. She waited. 5 seconds. 10. A minute. Then he returned. Shirt torn, blood on his temple. Not his. "It's done," he said. She didn't move, just stared at him. He crouched, pulled the rifle to her lap, then reached for her hand. Not rough. Not gentle. Just sure. "You're safe." She let herself breathe. For the first time since the sky turned white. Outside, the wind rose. But inside the cave, something had changed. She wasn't a widow anymore. She was someone else entirely. The sky split open 3 days later. Not with gunfire or storm, but with rain long awaited, bitter, and alive. It fell in sheets against the canyon walls, turning red dust to blood-colored mud, soaking the hides they'd hung, darkening the leather at her shoulders. She stood in it without flinching, face tipped to the sky, the first drops hitting her like memories. Inside the cave, he worked by firelight, stitching a long tear in his side. The bullet had only grazed him, but the wound spoke of a life that had outrun death too many times. He said nothing of the pain, just kept working, jaw clenched, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. She crouched beside him, tore another strip from the hem of her dress, pressed it into the wound with slow, sure hands. "You need to rest," she said. His voice was dry. "I rest when I die." She didn't laugh. "You'll die if you don't rest." For a moment, he met her eyes. Not with defiance, but something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or grief. She turned away before she could name it. The next morning, they buried the man who'd breached the cave. Not deep, just enough to cover. Coyotes would come eventually, but the earth, for now, held its silence. She placed a single stone at the grave's head. Not out of mercy, out of duty. "Do you know his name?" she asked. He shook his head. "Do you care?" He paused. "I care that he came." That was enough. The other bodies had disappeared, dragged away by whatever men still rode with vengeance in their hearts, or perhaps consumed by the land itself. She no longer feared them, not like before. But she knew better than to believe it was over. Men like that didn't die easy. Days passed, or maybe weeks. She lost count. The rhythm of the world no longer aligned with calendars and clocks. It moved instead by instinct, when to gather, when to hunt, when to wait. Together, they built more than shelter. A garden of sorts, wild herbs she'd learned to identify. A drying rack for meat. Even a small wall of stone to narrow the cave entrance, disguised with brush. They spoke more now. Not much, but enough. He told her of mountains farther west, where snow never melted and stars felt close enough to touch. She told him about a river town she'd grown up near, where the preacher wore boots 2 sizes too big and danced when he thought no one watched. He smiled at that. One night, as they sat beside a fire made more for comfort than warmth, she said, "If they come again, we don't run." He nodded. "We finish it." There was no pride in his voice, just certainty. She looked at her hands, no longer soft, no longer idle. "What am I now?" she asked. He didn't answer for a long time. Then, alive. That's the beginning of anything. She didn't sleep that night. The cave was too quiet, the world too still. She kept hearing the crack of gunfire in her mind, seeing the arrow in the man's throat, the blood that pooled without resistance. She hadn't wept, not once. But now her chest ached like grief had made a nest there. Not for her husband, not for the men who came, for the version of herself that had died when they left her behind. The storm returned on the 5th day, this one darker, colder. Thunder rolled in long, low growls, like the land was warning them. And then from the north, smoke. Not from a campfire, from something bigger. She saw it first, rising beyond the ridge in a lazy spiral. Her breath caught. He followed her gaze. "We don't wait," he said. They moved like shadows. Down through the narrow paths, packs slung over shoulders, weapons in hand. They crossed the dry bed of the creek, now churned to life with runoff, boots sinking into the clay. At the ridge's edge, they crouched beneath low brush and looked. The smoke came from a homestead, a small one. Wooden walls scorched black, a barn collapsed in on itself. No figures moved. No horses remained. She touched his arm. Not them. He shook his head. This was something else. They crept forward, cautious. The air stank of ash and old blood. Flies buzzed thick. Inside what had once been a home, they found a boy. No older than 10. Curled beneath an overturned table. Alive but barely. Eyes wide with the kind of fear no child should understand. She dropped her rifle. Went to him. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered. The boy didn't move. "He's in shock," he said. They built a fire behind the wreckage. boiled water, fed the boy what little they had. By nightfall he spoke. One word. Raiders. That was enough. She rocked him to sleep in her arms, humming that same half-remembered hymn. He watched from a distance, leaning on his bow, his face unreadable. They couldn't leave the boy. That much was clear. He had no name he'd share, no family to return to. But when she looked at him and said, "He stays," there was no argument. That night, as the boy slept between them, she asked the question that had haunted her since the first shot. "Why me?" He stared at the fire. "You were alone. Like me. That's not a reason. It's the only reason that matters." She let that settle. Outside, coyotes howled. Farther than before. The land maybe was shifting. She reached for his hand, not softly, not with hesitation. Like two people who had chosen the same road. He didn't pull away. The boy stirred, rolled toward the fire, and mumbled something in a language neither of them spoke. She brushed the hair from his brow. "We'll keep him safe," she said. He nodded. "And when he's strong enough, we'll teach him to fight." They stayed like that until the fire died. The cave wasn't home. Not anymore. They would move on, westward maybe, toward the mountains he'd once carved into his dreams, toward the future she'd once thought was lost. She was no longer a widow. He was no longer just a warrior. Together, they were something new. A family, made not by blood, but by fire, by scars, by the storm they'd walked through. And as the stars emerged above the wreckage of what had been, she knew this. Some stories don't end with silence. Some burn bright at the edge of the world, daring anyone to come and try again.